Jacob Turner, welcome to Bridging the Gap. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well, Matt. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, well, we were just talking before we started recording here. I'm super stoked about this conversation. I mean, I love all the conversations we have because I get to talk with interesting people, and this one's really kind of hits close to home for me. And given you solved for something that I always wanted to solve for when I first got in the industry, growing up a baseball player and an avid sports fan. I wanted to serve sports athletes. I want to serve athletes. I wanted to be in that realm, and
Yeah.
and you've done it. So I'm really I'm stoked to kind of go down that path of how you've done it and how you approached it. And I think having someone that's played the game, been in the league, and then serving them is the right approach to do. So I'm excited to do that, and kind of get into things with you because I admire what you've done. But before we do that and we talk about kind of some of the differences between athletes and that transition and how we can relate it to retirees and how do we serve them, I want to start just kind of with getting to know you a little bit. So I know you played in the bigs. I'm curious, you actually lived out a lot of kids' dreams by playing in the big leagues, but I always like to start this by saying, what did the 13-year-old Jacob Turner want to be? Was it to be a financial advisor to athletes? Or did you live your dream of being an athlete and being a baseball player? Well, what did the 13-year-old want to be?
Well, I'll start with a story. I can remember in carpool, this is probably seventh grade, so around 13. Seventh grade, the individual that took us to carpool, she's carpooling us in one day, and she turns around and she asks us, I think there was about 6 of us in the car, what do you want to be when you grow up? So everybody goes around and says what they want to be when they grow up, and I say I want to be a professional baseball player. I'll never forget her reaction. She turned around and she looked right at me and she was like, well, Jacob, you need to pick something a little bit more realistic. And look, as a 13-year-old, you don't know what's realistic and what's not, but that was what I always wanted to be. And, fortunately, I had a lot of God-given ability, and there was a lot of things that fell my way to allow me to live out that dream.
I think that's incredible. We all know the odds. Even as kids, we're still naive, but we still understand that it's really a difficult thing. But, then to have the parent tell us like, hey, why don't you want to be a firefighter? Like something you can actually do, right? Like, come on, talk about smashing dreams. Well, talk to us about the journey, right? Like talk to us about your process. I think it's always interesting to talk to athletes because it is something that a lot of us aspire, boys, girls, young kids looking up to athletes. And so I'm curious on your journey from that moment in the car and carpool when the carpool driver said you can't do it, pick something more realistic, to today, right? Walk us through that journey of kind of baseball, what led you into finance ultimately, and then what led you to kind of start your own firm as well.
Yeah, on the baseball side, I grew up with 2 brothers, and my parents were extremely supportive of us playing sports, and sports was really all we ever did. When the time we came home from school, we played baseball and we played hockey. So those were the 2 things that we did. We watched SportsCenter on repeat when we originally got cable TV, but sports were living and breathing what we did. So it was kind of a natural progression I had the talent, I put the work in, I had the support system around me. I ended up getting drafted as an 18-year-old kid, played for 11 years of professional baseball. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunities I had, the lessons I learned along the way. And much to your point, Matt, a lot of those lessons I learned along the way and those experiences led me to, 1, having a love around personal finance, and 2, helping to educate other people that are in a similar situation. So when I got done playing baseball, it was, okay, well, how can I use these skills that I now have that are in this little bit of a unique skill set to help the next generation of guys? I've also loved being an entrepreneur, loved the thought and idea of starting my own business and growing it from something to something bigger. And that's really what led us to starting Moment about 3 years ago now.
I love that. And, I want to go on a tangent for a second because I'm just really curious about it. I've seen a lot of guys do this. You went over and played in South Korea for a little bit.
Yep.
Talk to me about that experience. So you lived in South Korea for how long? Tell me about the cultural differences, going from, Missouri or Detroit or Washington, wherever you went from there to South Korea seems like a pretty drastic transition. Tell me about that. I'm curious there.
Well, if you think it was a drastic transition for me, imagine me sitting in the waiting room with my wife about to give birth to our 3rd child. And I tell her that I just talked to my agent and we're going to sign with a team in South Korea. And let me preface this by saying, Matt, the discussions we had up to this point was like right before bed for 5 minutes. I think there might be an opportunity there. And the way these teams work in Korea is it's very much a cultural thing. they offer you and they expect to hear something back from you in 24 to 48 hours. If they don't, they're moving on. So that was how our journey started. I went from St. Louis, Missouri to South Korea, not Seoul, South Korea, which is the capital, which is very much Americanized. We lived in a city called Gwangju, South Korea. And the way I would describe it from a comparison standpoint is if you took somebody from South Korea and you moved them to the United States and they thought they were going to New York City and they ended up in Detroit. So Gwangju is very much it's a manufacturing town. It's the headquarters of Kia Motors. So just like Detroit's the headquarters of Ford and GM, it's a hardworking town, but there's not a ton of people that speak English there. And it's what I would call true Korea. So it was a culture shock moment when I first got there because I really didn't know what I was getting into. I knew it was a good baseball opportunity, but I didn't understand all the other facets of it. But we had a great time. It opened our eyes to the rest of the world. It made us appreciate some of the things that we take for granted here in the United States. And frankly, from a baseball standpoint, it was a ton of fun.
I love that. And so you took your newborn and your two other kids. How old were they? Just flew kind of like on a nice little jet over to South Korea, which from St. Louis, Missouri seems like it's like a 4-day trip, it would seem like. But I can't even imagine. So with newborn, you just flew over to South Korea and they kind of just lived there for a year. Was it a year or 2 years over there?
Yeah, so I spent a year over there. I was there for about 10 months. My wife and kids were there for about half that time, so about 5 months out of the year. They flew over on a 15-hour flight. I joke that the team was willing to pay for business class seats for all of them. So my newborn had her own business class seat, so I can imagine the looks I'm sure my wife was getting as people were walking past her thinking that, I can't believe you paid $4,000 or whatever it was for this business class seat for the newborn. But it was an interesting experience nonetheless.
Your wife is a saint to fly 15 hours with 3 kids, one of them being a newborn. I mean, she is an absolute saint. So give her all my props forever on that side. But shifting gears, I'm curious from your perspective. You retired from the game and you transitioned to helping the next generation of big leaguers and athletes in general with their finances. What was, when you were in the game and you were around the players, what was the challenge that they faced when it came to financial decisions and financial well-being and financial literacy and just wealth management in general? What was the challenge that you saw inside the clubhouse that maybe some of us don't see?
I think the challenge is just inherently that you're coming from a background that you know nothing. If you think about the average American, their peak earning years are going to be somewhere between, let's call it 45 and 60. So realistically, they've had 20 to 30 years, 2 to 3 decades to make financial mistakes, stub their toe, learn lessons, learn maybe I shouldn't have bought that thing, but I did buy it. But it didn't ruin me because my peak earning years were sometime in the future versus an athlete. My peak earning years were from 18 to 25 years old. And if I made big financial mistakes then, there was no going back to do it over again. I wasn't going to have the same opportunity to make that level of money and income. And it's this double-edged sword because as a athlete, if you're getting the money at such a young age, we all know the power of compounding, right? If we just assume money's going to double every 10 years with solid investment returns, it's pretty easy to do the math. You invest $1 million, it grows to be worth 2, then 4, then 8, then 16. But on the flip side of that, if you blow it, you don't do the right things on the upfront, you can't go back and earn that same millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I never really thought about the difference in peak earning years and the benefit of having the peak earning years later in life because you can make the mistakes. And by the time you get later in life, you're also closer and closer to retirement so that it doesn't seem as drastic and far away. So you make different psychological decisions and cognitive decisions as well. And this question I'm going to ask, I'm going to tailor it more towards athletes, but I think it can be tailored towards anybody, is I'm curious how you cracked the nut to help them understand that they need to take action today, and especially like when you said 18 to 25. The idea of putting money away and saving money is so hard. And I had many conversations, as I mentioned, like we tried to serve athletes. That just was not our niche. But we had conversations with them, and it was a hard conversation to help them understand that you can't go and live this life and have 3 houses, a house at your spring training and house at your hometown and a house at where your big league team is and live all that life because of your signing bonus. Like we need to save it. It's very difficult to get that through. I'm curious how you've been able to help athletes overcome that hurdle, which is just a human instinct, but I'm going to tailor it towards baseball players or athletes in general right now?
The first thing that has been helpful for me is that I just share openly my own experiences, especially with the guys that we work with. I'll happily share exactly what my financial situation looked like when I played and what it looks like today. And I do that because what I'm trying to articulate to them is my outcome was what I would classify as a bottom 20% career outcome. I was a top 10 draft pick. If you look at guys that are top 10 draft picks that go on to become top 10 prospects in all of baseball, we're talking a laundry list of people that have made 50 plus, 100 plus millions of dollars, right? My career did not go the way that some of those folks went. I classify it as a bottom 20% career outcome. But what I tell guys is, although there was a lot of things that were outside of my control that led to this outcome, from a financial perspective, I felt like it was a top 5% outcome. Because the reality is in professional sports, there's going to be so many things that are going to be outside of your control. But the one thing that can be totally inside of your control is what you do with your money. And when you show somebody that picture and you frame up that in their mind of, if I make this money in the draft and I never make another dollar in baseball, and this is the number that I could potentially retire from the game with at, let's call it 30, if I just do all these things that are totally inside of my control, that's a pretty good outcome. And it's pretty advantageous for a guy to want to take that route. But that requires educating them. And I think for me, I educate them by sharing stories that have happened in my own career.
I think that something you said there, especially at the end right there with stories from yourself and your own career, there's this power in relatability, right? I think that that's where, why you're successful and why I wasn't. I can only talk about high school baseball where I didn't earn any money, and they're talking about pro baseball when they got, $1 million, a couple $1 million signing bonus. There's this relatability aspect and a vulnerability, right? You have the vulnerability of sharing your story, and that really resonates with them. And then how can I'm curious on the side of these individuals, just like yourself, got to the big leagues through this discipline, this really focused determination that was so keenly on one thing, being the best potential baseball player that you could be. And now you've got money, and that's not really your skill set, but that mentality can translate over into success within financial management. How have you helped, to kind of help individuals harness that kind of drive that got them so successful at the peak of something that's so difficult, to then also doing something that tends to be difficult for many humans, which is sticking true and building a financial plan? How have you helped them harness that mindset and put the power towards wealth management?
I think a lot of it stems from one thing, and it's just discipline, right? If you're a top performer, if you are a professional athlete, if you're really good at personal finance, the tie-in between all three of those things is that you have some level of discipline. You have some level to say that I'm going to either delay gratification or I'm willing to do these things for a really long period of time because I know if I do that, the outcome in the end is going to be really good, even on the days that I don't want to do it. So that's the first thing that I would say. And then I think the second thing is, again, it's just going back and saying, how can we take the skills that you have and tell stories in a way to educate you in a way that you want to be engaged in this process? A common misconception that I hear is that, oh, well, athletes, they don't care what's going on. And I would tell anybody, if somebody walked down the street and took $100 out of your pocket, would you care? And every single person in America would say, yeah, I would care. And I think that's the same thing that athletes feel, but they just don't know what questions to ask. And then they don't want to be in a room with somebody that's talking over their head. So what our goal is with all the clients we work with is, and I tell them this is a done with you process. This is not a done for you process. And the difference there is, the reason why it's a done with you process is I do not want you to get done playing baseball or playing whatever sport you're playing and be 30 plus years old and not know how to pay a credit card bill and not understand some of the basics of personal finance. So we try to use every time that we have a communication with a client to be able to teach them something new about their personal financial life.
I love the done with you aspect. And I think that's also, how I envision that is that it's also kind of like a training tool, not to only become financial well-being, but like, you got to think about post baseball because it's not going to last forever. That is kind of a profession that, is going to have an end date early in your life, where you still have a lot of life to live. So I think that that's really empowering. At as you transition from baseball, and I think this will be good for a lot of advisors out there that are entrepreneurial or thinking about taking the entrepreneurial leap. As you transition from the structure of baseball, there was structure of you knew that you had to train this way, you had your off season, etc., to then entrepreneurship and startup world of starting your own business. What challenges did you find that you had to overcome as you made that transition? Because I've seen that athletes have some transition difficulty going from athletics to the professional world because there's a lot more kind of white space out there.
Three things come to mind for me, Matt. The first one being the transition from the locker room to a more professional corporate setting, if you want to say, is different than most people realize. If you're in a locker room, you're typically there with a bunch of guys that are relatively type A. And if we don't like each other, or we didn't get along that day, you might say something that you don't really mean. And 30 seconds later, we can all agree that we're just going to get over it and move on. And nobody's really going to hold a grudge because that's just the way the locker room works. There's good-natured rubbing, all those things. That level of brashness, so to speak, does not work in quote-unquote real life. So that's one. The second thing is you're coming from a world where, even for me, I was not the best player on the team, but I was still a professional athlete. I still finished my career making millions of dollars. There was some level of ego there. And you really got to check your ego at the door because you're really starting from ground zero again. And you have to understand that. Yes, you have some skills that you learned playing baseball. Yes, there's things that are going to translate. But the reality is you need to humble yourself and start from ground zero again. And the third thing is something that I think you touched on. In sports and athletics, you have all of this structure. You go to the field, and yes, you're kind of doing things on your own, but they're telling you that stretch is at this time, the game is going to be at this time. When we have a road trip, you need to be on the bus or the plane at this time. Especially when you go into the entrepreneurship world, there's all this white space. You have all this freedom to do whatever you want to do. So creating structure around the days that you have to one, determine like what are the highest and best use of my time and what should I be focusing on? How should I be spending that? How should I be playing that out? Because I don't have anybody giving me a framework anymore or a schedule that I should be going off of.
How did you overcome that third one? I want to go to the second one as well because I'm really curious on the ego side because I think that there's something I want to talk about in terms of our industry and how you made that transition. But with the structure side, because I think that some athletes that I've talked to say, I love the freedom. Like, I don't want to go back to that structure. It was like so structured. And then they don't know how to build the structure because they're worried about going back to what was so structured. And then others just don't even know where to start. So when you think about building structure in terms of your focus of building a business, this isn't just like going and doing a job. This is literally building a business where you have to start without much background because you're a professional athlete for most of your life. How did you overcome that as you started building the business?
Well, it's been a gradual process, but the quote that I always go back to, or the framework that I always go back to, is we all have the same 24 hours in a day. I think there's this misconception in America, especially that we talk about the 9 to 5, right? People go to work from 9 to 5, and one of the things I learned when I first started working in this industry, so I took a job for about 6 months where I essentially was not worried at all about making any money. I just wanted to learn skills. And it was at a multifamily office that did really quality work. But one of the things that always came to mind for me was it might be like 1:00 on a Tuesday and all the work would, so to speak, be done for the day, but everybody was still going to be there till 5. And I always thought, like, why is everybody still here if all the work's done? And I have really focused on saying, what is the most efficient use of my time? Okay, so I'll use an example. One thing that I do that is a rock for me in terms of filling up my jar with rocks first and sand second is my health. So I wake up in the morning and nearly every single day I will walk outside for 45 minutes before my kids wake up. It gives me a good time to think. It gives me a good time to process, to reset, to come up with content that I'm going to potentially write that day. Then I take my kids to school and then I go work out. So those are non-negotiables. I do those literally every single day, rain, shine, no matter what. And I know that if I do those things, my health is going to be prioritized. And then usually the next thing I do is do something around either client work or creating content where I'm helping to either educate the individuals that I'm working with currently or educate other people that are out there. Now, that traditional schedule for me doesn't mean that I'm in the office from 9 to 5. It means that I'm doing the things that are the most important to move the business forward and move my life forward. But it's taken me a long time to get over the fact that like it's okay if I'm at the gym at 9 o'clock and everybody else is at work.
Yeah, I think that that's a mentality of that stems from confidence, that stems from identifying what your true purpose is and what you value in life, right? And if you can't do that, then you're not doing the right thing, and you've identified a way to make that all happen. And then I'm curious on the side of, um, with regards to ego. I think that that's a hard one, and I think that in our industry, I think that there's a lot of people that have ego. I think in any industry, not just our industry. And you kind of went from one industry and then had to start over, and you had to do this transition. What are some things for some individuals that may want to figure out how to check their ego or back down their ego that allowed you to go from this, somewhat of an ego, rightfully so, by the way,
Yeah.
to having to kind of put that at the door and say, you know what? I'm okay not knowing everything. I'm just curious about that, like kind of bridging to that area, because that's really hard to do, going from anything.
Well, I'm a lifelong learner. And one thing I've learned as I've continued to try to educate myself is that the more I know, the more I realize I either don't know today or I definitely didn't know 5 or 10 years ago. So for me, I learned a lot of times the hard way in terms of I learned something and then I realized, wow, I've been doing it wrong this entire time. Whether it's communication, whether it's something strategically, I'm always trying to learn something new. So a lot of my experiences in terms of checking my ego have been more like slaps in the face where you can't miss it. You're saying like, I had an ego around this and now I'm realizing that I should not have an ego around this. I can remember a guy who's a mentor for me had a business and we were talking about, I think he was talking about employee compensation and I was kind of talking about my situation. And, he's like, I think the guy that runs your company is doing it the exact right way. And I was like, what do you mean? No, let me explain. And now I look back on that conversation and he was 100% right. And I didn't know what I didn't know, but I felt like, okay, well, I'm relatively astute in this. Like I'm adding a lot of value. So like it should equate to this. And it's just me constantly trying to learn and iterate and understand that I don't have this all figured out. I will never have this all figured out. Nobody has this all figured out. I think has helped me to make quick transitions when I realize I'm wrong.
Yeah, I love that idea. And that, two things come to mind from what you were talking about with structure and then also with ego. The one on structure is this quote from Shane Parrish, and who runs a blog called Farnham Street. And, I'm not going to say it perfectly, but basically in his book, Clear Thinking, he talks about this concept of, everybody looks at all these people that are doing things so well and just think that they just got it all together. But what they don't see under there is like a very rigid structure. Like they are doing things like with intention and continuously every single day. And that structure creates what is outside seen. And it's not just this like they're just like good and they just know what they're doing. What you see is not truly what's being done to get to that point. And I think that, that's also something I learned in the technology world, building a technology company, was I tried to just replicate another company. And what I realized is what I'm seeing on the front end is lifelong lessons in the back end of continuous things that I had no clue about. And I don't learn it until I get into it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I am so far behind on that side. And then the second point is, this natural inclination to curiosity. That's something that I've learned from a lot of really successful leaders, is that, being naturally curious is extremely impactful, and understanding kind of that you don't know everything. Your story reminded me of this stupid reality show that was on TV once, and I was watching it. And like the person was like an 18-year-old kid, and he was talking to his mom and basically like, hey, I needed you 2 years ago, but now I'm good. I don't need a mom to parent me because I know everything. And I'm like, this kid's so far from the truth. Like, yeah, you always need a parent to parent you, right? And that is the type of ego. If you can lessen that and say, I don't know everything and I'm okay to learn from other people, even subordinates and younger people, you're going to be better off. I want to transition real quick to something that you kind of alluded to, but it's kind of it's all around building your brand from a marketing standpoint. You mentioned that you write a lot of content. I'm curious about the strategy, because I could see some people saying, Jacob's got it easy. Like, he played in the league, he's got connections in the league. Like, he can just go to the league and get connections to other players, and like, it's easy. He's got it easy. Let's set the story straight. It's probably not easy. So what is the strategy that you're using to market your services and get clients? And it sounds like content is one of them. I'm curious how you go about the whole strategy.
Yeah, well, let me first by saying that nothing that people want in life is easy. And people reach out to me all the time and ask about working in sports or working with athletes. And I just tell them the same thing, that it will take longer than you think. It will cost more money than you think. And you have to be prepared to fly around the country. So if you want to check all those boxes, then like, I think you should potentially explore it. But the reality is I do have a ton of connections in sports to a lot of different people in sports, and it's not easy. So let me say that first. The second thing is the reason why I do the content is because it allows me to try to educate people that I can't work with. I'm not going to work with every single individual out there, and it allows me to do that. The second part of the content is when I went through the process as even a professional athlete specifically, my parents were looking for good information, and it's really hard to figure out, this person's telling me one thing, but there's also this agenda here because they want me to work with them. When I produce content, you can read it for free. Nothing's behind a paywall. You're welcome to comment on it, like on it, send me a message about it. I might respond to it. And it gives people this open resource of, this is my opinions. This is my knowledge base. And I'm going to take it and put it out there into the world for you. And if you don't like it, great. You don't have to follow me. But if you do like it, hopefully you're getting something out of it.
Well, I want to dive onto that for a second, right? Content, I think, is one of the hottest topics that advisors are starting to try to explore to build their thought leadership and to attract clients, etc. But there has to be this like differentiation in the content. What have you found to be successful within your content strategy in terms of an approach to helping get readership, to help get interest, whatever it may be? What have you learned in that journey?
Wow, that's a loaded question because I've learned a lot. I started by
maybe the top
having
two
really,
things.
I've really never written content online outside of the past almost 2 years now. So I was starting from nothing. I've always loved writing. I've always loved talking to people, but I've never really put myself out there and shared the types of things I've shared over the last 2 years. And the thing that I've learned is, much to your point, Matt, there's information that's out there via Google, right? If you want to learn any basic personal finance concept, you can Google it, and there'll be 10 articles on the first page that are well written that will outline it to you. And if you want a video format, you can go to YouTube and do it too. The thing I think that differentiates people in creating content is earned experience. When you start sharing earned experiences that you've actually gone through yourself, and not only do you walk through that same strategy that you can find on the first page of Google, but now you connect it to how you're actually using it in your life, or maybe how you're using it in a client's life. Now all of a sudden that story becomes really real, because the guy that owns a business, and when I talk about something I'm doing in my business to maybe save money in taxes, he's like, well, I kind of feel like I'm in that same situation, as opposed to just randomly talking about a tax strategy.
Yeah. Earned experience is truly there. And it's got to be, I think it's got to be authentic, to your point that we talked about earlier. It's got to be vulnerable, how you're talking to clients. And it's got to be, a little bit deeper than surface level. It's got to have its own unique twist, which is, I think, something that we see there. I want to shift gears for a second and just kind of ask a random question, because I'm always curious, especially people that are entering the space that are a little bit newer. You come from a different background, right? Athlete to wealth management. You've been in the business for 3 years. You've built a great business. You're building a sustainable and long enduring business. Where do you see, two questions, and you can take them in whichever order you want. What's the biggest challenge that this industry faces from the other side, right? You were on the other side of it. Now you're on this side of it, is question one. Then question two is, from your perspective, being still fresh and a little naive in the industry, which is phenomenal, where do you see the future of this industry going from your perspective? And you can take it in whichever order you want.
Yeah. On the first question, what do I see as the biggest issue from the other side of the table? So for 10 years, I sat on the other side of the table and I worked with several different financial advisors. The biggest issue I see is trust. when you look out in the marketplace, there's a ton of people parading around as financial advisors that have no interest other than to line their pockets. And that's the truth. It's a really slimy part of an industry that overall does a lot of really good things. Building trust with clients and helping to show them your expertise, I think, is really crucial in 2023. And I think it goes back to the content. And then as far as where I see the industry going, I think the industry is going to a place that people don't want to be told what to do. They want to be shown that this is the way I should do it. When I think of my generation of clients, and I think of the clients that we brought in, a lot of the questions are, that sounds great, but why? Okay, tell me a little bit more about that. As opposed to, I think in previous generations, it's been more so, this is what we do. We get to this certain stage of our life and we hire a financial advisor. So there's a lot of tie-in to both of those answers to building a personal brand, in my opinion, creating content and showing the value that you have, not just telling somebody the value that you have.
Yeah. And I think what you're building really kind of like doubles down on two major points that we talk about on this podcast a lot. One is have a niche, which you do. It's a very unique niche. You know it well. And then it's two is building a really personal brand. And you do that with your content, with your earned experiences. And so I think that people have a lot to learn from you. And, I could probably have this conversation for hours, but we're going to kind of be cognizant of people's time and your time and everything of that nature. So I want to wrap up with, two final questions that I always like to ask our guests. And the first one is, you mentioned that you're a lifelong learner. I am as well. I love to learn by reading. So I'm curious, what's one book out there that you think everybody should read, or if they've already read it, they should reread it, that's had an impact on your life?
Yeah, well, I'll actually give you two. So the best book that I read last year is Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And I say that because he just came out with a new book, Same as Ever, which I'm sure will be just as phenomenal as Psychology of Money. But the best book that I've read this year, especially when it comes to wealth, building wealth, how to think about that and how to do it from any standpoint of no matter where you grow up, is a book called The Almanac of Naval Ravikant. So Naval is one of the top venture capitalists in the world, one of the best investors of our generation. And this book is really a data collection of all of his quotes, thoughts, frameworks around building wealth. And it's been really impactful for me to read that. It's one of those books that you could legitimately open it up to about any section of the book and just start reading at any point in the day and get something out of it.
That's incredible. I love that. And I will double down on the Psychology of Money, and I already have his new book on the way as well. So Morgan Housel, and his podcast is great too, if you want to take some podcasts to listen to. The last question I'll ask is, we talked about a lot here, right? We talked about kind of the transition. We talked about building a business. We talked about branding, content, etc. If there's one piece of actionable advice that you hope or that you would like for our audience to take away from this conversation, what would that one piece of actionable advice be for them?
Yeah, when we talked about a lot of the stuff, we talked about whether it's content, whether it's transitioning out of baseball, whether it's starting a business, all of those things have this tie-in of, well, what could go wrong? That's our normal human reaction. What's the worst thing that could happen? And I would just challenge anybody out there. There's always something that you're thinking about doing. Maybe it's making that first content post. Maybe it's starting a business. Maybe it's transitioning to something new. Just ask yourself, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen? And really sit with that for a second, because a lot of times what the worst thing that could happen is not near as bad as what we think it is. We drum it up in our head that, if this thing happens, I'm going to be homeless on the streets tomorrow. And the reality is that's probably not going to happen. So really sit and chew on the fact of, if I want to do the thing that I'm thinking about, what's the worst thing that can happen? And ultimately, I hope that leads to potential action towards doing that thing.
I love that. That is unbelievable advice, and something that you can act on right now if you want to. Jacob Turner, this has been a real pleasure, man, and real inspiration. And I know that people are going to want to continue to follow what you're doing and probably get in touch and just kind of stay in touch. What's the best way for people to do so and to kind of continue to follow your journey here as you grow your firm?
Yeah, I'm on all the major social media platforms. LinkedIn and Twitter are my two most active platforms right now. I'm also on Instagram, and then I'm starting a YouTube channel as well. And then our firm is momentprivatewealth.com, but you can connect with me at any of those places.
Love it. If you haven't done it, go connect with Jacob. You won't be disappointed. Jacob, again, thanks so much for spending some time with us here on Bridging the Gap. I really appreciate it, man.
Matt, thanks for having me on.